Settle yourself now. Let your body grow heavy against whatever surface holds you. The day is finished, its noise retreating like the tide going out, leaving behind only the quiet dark in this story. Tonight we travel to Italy, to the cities of Florence and Venice and Rome, to the workshops of painters and the studies of scholars, to the markets and the churches and the great halls where human beings, for the first time in a long time, looked at themselves and the world around them, and decided that both were worthy of serious, loving attention. We travel to the Renaissance. The word itself comes from the French and Italian words for rebirth, and it names one of the most extraordinary flowerings of human creativity and intellectual ambition in recorded history. Over the course of roughly 2 centuries, from the mid-14th century to the early 17th, the civilization of Western Europe underwent a transformation so profound and so far-reaching that the world that emerged from it was almost unrecognizable from the world that entered it. This is a story about art and ideas, about money and politics, about faith and doubt, about the courage it takes to look at the world with fresh eyes when everyone around you insists on seeing only what has always been seen before. It is also, in the way that all history is, a story about human beings, their ambitions and their fears, their generosity and their cruelty, their moments of breathtaking beauty and their moments of terrible smallness. Breathe slowly. Let the images come softly, like candlelight moving across the surface of an old painting. We begin at the beginning. Chapter 1: The World Before the Rebirth. To understand what was reborn in the Renaissance, we must first understand what had come before it, the world that the Renaissance was a response to, a conversation with, and in some ways a gentle rebellion against. The medieval world of Western Europe was not the dark, ignorant, superstition-ridden wasteland that later Renaissance writers sometimes made it out to be. That caricature is unfair and largely false. The medieval period produced extraordinary achievements in architecture, in philosophy, in theology and music, and in visual art. The great Gothic cathedrals that still stand in France and England and Germany are among the most ambitious and beautiful structures ever built by human hands. The philosophical tradition of scholasticism, associated with thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, represented a serious and sophisticated attempt to reconcile faith with reason. The illuminated manuscripts produced in medieval monasteries are works of extraordinary beauty and precision. But the medieval world did have a particular orientation toward human experience that the Renaissance would fundamentally challenge. In the medieval worldview, human life on earth was a brief and dangerous passage, a veil of tears through which the soul traveled on its way to either eternal salvation or eternal damnation. The body was suspect, the senses were unreliable, and the pleasures of earthly existence were at best distractions and at worst temptations. What mattered was not this world but the next. What mattered was not what human beings could achieve through their own intelligence and effort, but what God had determined for each soul from the beginning of time. This orientation produced magnificent religious art, art in which the figures of Christ and the Virgin and the saints shone with an otherworldly light, their forms deliberately non-naturalistic, their expressions serene beyond any earthly peace, their relationship to the physical world deliberately tenuous. The goal of this art was not to represent the world as it looked, but to point beyond the world to what lay behind it. It also produced a particular relationship to classical antiquity, to the ancient Greek and Roman world that had preceded Christianity. The medieval church had a complicated relationship with the classical past. On one hand, the Latin language and much classical learning had been preserved and transmitted largely through monastic education. On the other hand, the explicitly pagan content of much classical literature and philosophy was viewed with deep suspicion. The great works of ancient literature, Virgil, Ovid, Homer in translation, the philosophical works of Plato and Aristotle, were studied and used, but always filtered through a Christian interpretive lens, always read as prefigurements or allegories of Christian truth rather than as valuable in themselves. The Renaissance would change all of this. It would not reject Christianity, not at first, not for the most part, but it would insist, with increasing confidence and eventually with irresistible force, that the world as it is, the body as it is, the human mind as it is, were all worthy of serious attention and celebration. And it would find in the literature, philosophy, and art of ancient Greece and Rome not allegories of Christian truth, but direct embodiments of human wisdom that had value on their own terms. This shift from a world-denying orientation to a world-affirming one, from a God-centered understanding of humanity to a human-centered understanding that still included God, from a suspicious relationship with classical antiquity to a passionate embrace of it, was the essential movement of the Renaissance. But why did it happen when and where it did? Why Italy? Why the 14th and 15th centuries? The answers to these questions take us into economics, into politics, into geography, and into the particular accidents of history that brought certain ideas and certain people into contact at certain moments. Chapter 2: Italy and the City-States. Italy in the 14th century was not a unified nation. It would not become one until 1861. Instead, the Italian peninsula was a patchwork of city-states, principalities, and kingdoms, each with its own government, its own culture, its own economy, and its own sense of identity and pride. This political fragmentation, which might seem like a weakness and in military terms often was, turned out to be an extraordinary engine of cultural competition and innovation. When a dozen city-states each consider themselves the center of civilization, each compete for the most talented artists and scholars, each try to outshine their neighbors in the magnificence of their architecture and the splendor of their courts, the result is an explosion of patronage and creativity that a single centralized kingdom might never have produced. Florence was perhaps the most important of these cities for the story of the Renaissance, though Venice, Milan, Rome, Naples, Ferrara, Mantua, and Urbino all played significant roles. Florence in the early 14th century was already one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, its economy built on two great industries, banking and wool. The banking families of Florence, most famously the Medici but also the Bardi, the Peruzzi, and the Strozzi, had developed financial instruments and practices that were sophisticated beyond anything else in the medieval world. They operated a network of banks across Europe, extending credit to kings and popes, financing wars and crusades and building projects on a scale that no individual ruler could have managed with their own resources. The letter of credit, the bill of exchange, debellentry bookkeeping, these were Florentine inventions or refinements, practical tools of commerce that had the unintended effect of creating a new kind of rational, calculating relationship with the material world. The wool industry complemented the banking sector. Florentine merchants imported raw wool from England and Spain, had it processed and woven in the city, and exported finished cloth across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Art della Lana, the Wool Guild, was one of the most powerful institutions in the city. The cloth trade required the same kind of rational calculation and long-term planning that the banking trade did. Assessing quality, managing inventories, negotiating prices across vast distances, understanding markets in a dozen different cities and cultures. This economic culture, practical, rational, concerned with the material world in a very direct and unromantic way, created a mentality that was receptive to the Renaissance's fundamental reorientation toward the world as it actually is. Men who spent their days calculating interest rates and assessing the quality of wool were not naturally inclined to regard the material world as merely a vale of tears through which the soul passed on its way to somewhere more important. They were also, as they became wealthy, naturally inclined to spend their money on beautiful things, and to want those beautiful things to reflect their own tastes, their own identities, their own sense of what was excellent and worthy of admiration. This is where art enters the story. Chapter 3: The Plague and the Question of Meaning. Before the Renaissance could fully flower, however, the medieval world had to suffer one of the greatest catastrophes in human history: the Black Death. The plague arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by fleas on rats aboard merchant ships from the Black Sea ports. It swept across the continent with a speed and ferocity that left contemporaries too stunned to even fully comprehend what was happening. In the space of roughly 3 years, between 1347 and 1351, the plague killed perhaps 1/3 of the entire population of Europe. Some regions lost half or more of their people. Florence, which had a population of perhaps 100,000 before the plague, lost perhaps 60,000 in a matter of months. The human experience of this catastrophe was almost beyond description. The chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence and who would later use it as the framing device for his great collection of stories, the Decameron, described scenes of social collapse, families abandoning their sick members, the dead piling up faster than they could be buried, the complete breakdown of all normal social bonds and obligations under the pressure of terror and grief. The plague did something strange to European consciousness. It had several effects that pointed in different directions. On one hand, it seemed to confirm the medieval worldview in its darkest form. The world was indeed dangerous and transient. Human life was indeed fragile and brief. Death was indeed the constant companion of the living. The image of the dance of death, the dance macabre, the figure of death leading people of all ranks and stations in a grim procession, became one of the dominant images of late medieval art. But on the other hand, the plague also had the effect of making life seem precious in a new and urgent way. When death is so close, so arbitrary, so indiscriminate, the response of many human beings is not to draw back from life, but to embrace it more fiercely. If your neighbor died of plague this morning and you did not, the question of how to spend the afternoon takes on a new and almost desperate urgency. Boccaccio's Decameron captures this double response perfectly. The frame story is the plague itself, that terrible backdrop of mass death, but the stories told within it are, for the most part, funny, sexy, irreverent, worldly tales full of clever people outwitting stupid ones, of lovers finding their way to each other despite all obstacles, of life insisting on itself against the background of death. This was not piety. This was something else, a fierce, joyful, sometimes desperate celebration of human intelligence and human desire. This sensibility, born in part from the experience of catastrophic mortality, fed directly into the Renaissance's celebration of human life and human potential. The plague also had a more practical effect. It disrupted the existing social order in ways that created new opportunities. Labor became scarce and therefore more valuable. Inherited wealth and position were no longer as stable as they had seemed. In a world where 1/3 of the people had died, there were opportunities for those who remained that had not existed before. Social mobility, always difficult in the medieval world, became slightly more possible. And the church, which had not been able to protect its flock from the plague, had not been able to explain it satisfactorily, had in some places simply collapsed under the weight of the crisis, emerged from the Black Death with its authority somewhat diminished and its institutions somewhat weakened. Not everywhere, not permanently, but enough to create a small but significant opening for new ways of thinking about the world and humanity's place in it. Chapter 4: Petrarch and the Discovery of the Ancients. If there is a single individual who can be called the father of the Renaissance, most historians would nominate Francesco Petrarca, known to us as Petrarch, a poet and scholar born in 1304 who died in 1374, the year before the plague swept through Florence for the second time. Petrarch was not the first medieval European to read and admire the Latin classics. Throughout the medieval period, monasteries had preserved and copied ancient manuscripts, and educated people had read Virgil and Cicero and Ovid. But Petrarch had a different relationship with the ancient world than any of his predecessors. He did not read the ancient Romans as prefigurements of Christian truth. He did not read them as allegories pointing beyond themselves to something more important. He read them as companions, as friends across time, as people who had thought deeply about the same questions that occupied him and who had something direct and valuable to say to him. His letters to the ancient writers, literally letters he composed addressing Cicero or Livy as if they were old friends he had lost touch with, are among the most revealing documents of the early Renaissance. They express a passionate sense of personal connection with the ancient world, a feeling that the centuries separating him from Cicero were less important than the human qualities they shared: the curiosity, the ambition, the love of language, the desire to understand the world. Petrarch also pioneered a new way of looking at history. In the medieval worldview, history was essentially a single continuous story, the history of salvation, stretching from the creation through the incarnation of Christ toward the final judgment. The centuries before Christ were a prefigurement. The centuries since were a waiting, an anticipation. The ancient Romans fit into this story as figures who had prepared the way for Christianity, however unknowingly. Petrarch saw history differently. He saw it as divided into periods with distinctly different characters. The ancient world, particularly the Roman world at its height, was for him a time of greatness, a time when human beings had achieved remarkable things in literature, in government, in philosophy, in art. Then had come a long period of decline, what he called the Dark Ages, in which the light of ancient achievement had been dimmed and obscured. And now, in his own time, there was the possibility of a renewal, a recovery, a rebirth of the ancient excellence. This periodization, ancient greatness, medieval decline, modern renewal, is the essential structure of the Renaissance self-understanding, and Petrarch was the first to articulate it clearly. He was also, not coincidentally, a great poet. His sonnets in Italian, addressed to a woman named Laura whom he loved from a distance with an exquisite, agonized devotion, were among the most influential poems ever written in any European language. They were copied, translated, imitated, and admired across the continent for centuries. They demonstrated that the vernacular language, Italian as distinct from the Latin of scholarship and the church, could achieve artistic heights equal to any ancient model. This mattered enormously. It suggested that the modern world, the world of the 14th century, was not merely a pale reflection of ancient greatness, but could produce its own authentic achievements. The Renaissance was not simply an attempt to copy the ancient world. It was an attempt to rival it, to learn from it, and then go beyond it. Chapter 5: Boccaccio and the Celebration of the World. Petrarch's great friend and fellow pioneer of the new learning was Giovanni Boccaccio, born in 1313, who died in 1375. Where Petrarch was primarily a scholar and a poet of courtly love and scholarly devotion, Boccaccio was something richer and stranger, a storyteller of genius, whose greatest work, the Decameron, is one of the landmarks of world literature. The Decameron, composed in the early 1350s in the immediate aftermath of the plague, consists of 100 stories told over 10 days by a group of 7 young women and 3 young men who have retreated to the hills outside Florence to escape the epidemic. The stories range from the bawdy to the tragic, from the comic to the deeply moving, from tales of cleverness and wit to tales of great love and great loss. What makes the Decameron revolutionary is not any single story but the totality of its vision. Boccaccio looks at the full range of human experience, the desires of the body, the workings of fortune, the intelligence of women, the foolishness of men, the cruelty of fate, the resilience of love, and he treats it all with a warmth, a humor, and an honesty that was unlike anything that had come before in medieval literature. He writes about sex without shame or condemnation. He writes about greed without assuming it is always evil. He writes about hypocrisy, particularly clerical hypocrisy, with a sharp wit that suggests he has a clear eye for the gap between professed ideals and actual behavior. He writes about women as full human beings with intelligence, wit, desires, and moral complexity, not as the Virgin Mary idealized beyond humanity or Eve condemned as the source of sin. This is the humanist vision in its earliest and most exuberant form, a willingness to look at human beings as they actually are, with all their contradictions and complexity, and to find them interesting, worthy of attention, sometimes admirable, sometimes ridiculous, always fascinatingly alive. Boccaccio also did crucial work as a scholar of the ancient world. He searched for and recovered lost Latin manuscripts, learned Greek at a time when almost no Western European scholar could read it, and wrote scholarly works on ancient mythology and ancient women's lives that helped lay the groundwork for the humanist scholarly project of the generations that followed. Together, Petrarch and Boccaccio established the program of the Renaissance: passionate engagement with classical antiquity, celebration of the human world in all its complexity, cultivation of the vernacular languages as vehicles for serious literary and intellectual work, and a fundamental confidence in the value of human experience and human intelligence. Chapter 6: The Humanists and Their Project. The word that historians use most often to describe the intellectual culture of the Renaissance is humanism, and it is worth taking a moment to understand what this word actually meant in its historical context, because it is rather different from what it means today. Renaissance humanism was not primarily a philosophical position about the nature of the universe or the existence of God. Most Renaissance humanists were sincere Christians who had no interest in rejecting their faith. Rather, humanism referred to a program of studies, the Studia Humanitatis, which included grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, all studied primarily through the texts of classical antiquity. The humanists believed that the study of these subjects, conducted through careful reading of the best ancient texts, would produce not just learned people but good people, people who could write and speak well, who had a deep understanding of human nature and human history, who could serve their cities and their rulers with wisdom and eloquence. This was a fundamentally practical educational program, aimed at producing the kind of cultivated, articulate, morally serious person who could function effectively in the public life of a city-state or a court. The ideal humanist was not a cloistered scholar removed from the world, but an engaged citizen, a counselor, a diplomat, a man of letters who could bring the wisdom of the ancients to bear on the practical problems of the present. The humanists were also scholars in a technical sense. They devoted enormous energy to the recovery, editing, and interpretation of ancient texts. Manuscripts of classical authors had been preserved in monastery libraries across Europe and the Byzantine world, often in a single copy, sometimes damaged or incomplete, their texts corrupted by centuries of copying errors. The humanists hunted for these manuscripts with the intensity of treasure hunters, traveling to distant libraries, exchanging information about what might be found where, writing excited letters to each other when a new discovery was made. The Florentine book dealer Poggio Bracciolini was one of the greatest of these manuscript hunters. In the early decades of the 15th century, on diplomatic missions that took him to libraries in Germany and Switzerland, he found lost works by Cicero, by Quintilian, by Lucretius, and by others. Each discovery was a kind of resurrection, a voice from the ancient world speaking again after centuries of silence. When Poggio found a complete manuscript of Quintilian's Institutes of Oratory in a monastery in St. Gallen in 1416, he wrote a letter describing the manuscript as sitting in a dark, filthy dungeon, covered in dust, its text crying out for rescue from its neglect. This is not merely rhetoric. The humanists genuinely felt these manuscripts as living presences, as embodiments of minds that had something urgent and irreplaceable to say. The recovery and study of ancient texts had practical as well as cultural consequences. When scholars compared multiple manuscripts of the same text and found that they differed from each other, they had to develop methods for determining which reading was more likely to be authentic. This practice, called textual criticism, was the beginning of the modern scholarly discipline of philology. And the habits of mind it developed, careful comparison of sources, attention to historical context, willingness to question received authority, skepticism about inherited texts, would eventually be applied not just to the works of Cicero and Plato, but to the Bible itself, with consequences that would shake the entire structure of Western Christendom. Chapter 7. Florence under the Medici. No account of the Renaissance can proceed very far without confronting the Medici family, whose patronage shaped the culture of Florence for more than a century, and whose influence extended throughout Italy and beyond. The Medici were not ancient nobility. They were bankers, merchants, men who had built their fortune through commerce and financial acumen. The family's rise to prominence began in earnest with Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici in the late 14th century, who established the Medici Bank and laid the financial foundations on which his descendants would build their cultural empire. His son Cosimo de' Medici, known as Cosimo the Elder, was the first great Medici patron and the de facto ruler of Florence from 1434, when he returned from a brief exile, until his death in 1464. Cosimo was a man of remarkable intelligence and subtlety. He never held formal political office in Florence. The city was technically a republic, and the fiction of republican government was maintained. But through a combination of wealth, political manipulation, strategic patronage, and genuine personal authority, he exercised a dominance over Florentine affairs that was effectively that of a prince, without the title. Cosimo understood, as the great patrons of the Renaissance generally did, that cultural investment was not merely personal vanity but political strategy. A ruler who built magnificent churches and libraries, and who supported artists and scholars, was demonstrating to his fellow citizens, and to the wider world, that his city was a center of civilization, that its government was enlightened, that wealth in his hands produced beauty and wisdom rather than mere luxury. This was not cynical. Cosimo genuinely loved learning and art, but he also understood their political utility. His most important cultural achievement was the establishment of the Platonic Academy in Florence, a gathering of scholars and philosophers under the guidance of the brilliant Marsilio Ficino, who undertook the monumental task of translating all of Plato's dialogues into Latin, making them available for the first time to Western European scholars who could not read Greek. Plato had been known in the medieval West primarily through second-hand summaries and through a few texts that had been transmitted in Latin translation. The full corpus of his dialogues was a revelation. Ficino's translations and his own philosophical writings, which sought to reconcile Platonic philosophy with Christian theology, gave the intellectual culture of Florence a new depth and complexity. Neoplatonism, the philosophical tradition that saw the material world as a reflection of a higher spiritual reality, provided artists and poets with a rich framework for thinking about beauty, love, and the relationship between the human and the divine. Cosimo also patronized the arts in the most direct sense, commissioning buildings, sculptures, and paintings. He supported the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, whose dome for the Cathedral of Florence was the greatest engineering achievement of the century. He supported the sculptor Donatello, one of the greatest artists of the Renaissance. He built libraries and filled them with manuscripts. His grandson Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, who ruled Florence from 1469 until his death in 1492, brought the Medici patronage system to its fullest flowering. Lorenzo was himself a poet of real ability, a subtle and cultivated man whose household became the meeting place of the greatest minds of his generation. The young Michelangelo was educated in Lorenzo's household. The philosopher Pico della Mirandola, the poet Poliziano, the Neoplatonist Ficino, All were part of the circle that gathered around Lorenzo in the gardens and halls of the Medici Palace. Under the Medici, Florence became, in the words of Leonardo Bruni, one of the city's own humanist chancellors, the New Athens, a city that combined commercial vitality with intellectual and artistic achievement, a place where the ancient ideals of the active civic life and the cultivated mind were being realized in a modern form. Chapter 8: Brunelleschi and the Dome. In the year 1418, the city of Florence faced a problem that had been facing it for more than a century: the unfinished dome of its cathedral. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore had been under construction since 1296. It was one of the most ambitious building projects in medieval Europe, a cathedral intended to express the wealth, the piety, and the civic pride of Florence in the most magnificent architectural terms possible. But the architects of 1296 had made a promise that subsequent generations did not know how to keep. They had designed an octagonal drum at the crossing of the nave and transept, 83 feet in diameter, at a height of nearly 200 feet from the floor, and they had planned a dome to cover it. The problem was that no one knew how to build a dome of that size. The standard medieval technique for constructing a dome or vault required a wooden centering, a temporary structure that held the masonry in place while it was being built and until the mortar set. A wooden centering for a dome of the size planned for the Florence Cathedral would have required more timber than existed in all of Tuscany. It was structurally impossible. For more than a century, the drum sat open to the sky, covered with a temporary wooden structure, an embarrassing reminder of the limits of medieval engineering. In 1418, the Opera del Duomo, the committee responsible for the cathedral's construction, held a competition for ideas about how to solve the problem. And among the competitors was a small, difficult, brilliant goldsmith and clockmaker turned architect named Filippo Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi's solution was extraordinary in its ingenuity. He proposed to build the dome without any centering at all, using a system of herringbone brickwork, interlocking courses of stone and brick, and an ingenious double-shell construction, an inner dome and an outer dome linked by stone ribs that would distribute the weight in such a way that the structure supported itself as it rose. He also invented new machines to lift the heavy building materials to heights that had never been achieved before. The Opera del Duomo was skeptical. Brunelleschi was not an architect by training. He was erratic, secretive, and difficult to deal with. He refused to explain his methods in detail, worried that his ideas would be stolen. But eventually he convinced them, and in 1420 construction of the dome began. It took 16 years. The dome that rose over Florence during those years, the great red-tiled curve that still dominates the city's skyline, was a technical achievement of the highest order. But it was also something more than that. It was a statement about what human intelligence and human ambition could achieve. It was a monument not just to the glory of God, but to the capacity of human beings to master the physical world through ingenuity and determination. This was a deeply Renaissance statement, and Brunelleschi did not stop at the dome. He went on to create a new architecture, inspired by his careful study of ancient Roman buildings in Rome, that abandoned the vertical thrust of Gothic architecture for the harmonious horizontal proportions of the classical tradition. His Ospedale degli Innocenti, his Pazzi Chapel, his churches of San Lorenzo and Santo Spirito in Florence. All of these buildings embody a new aesthetic, calm, rational, harmoniously proportioned, rooted in the mathematical relationships of classical architecture, but transformed by Brunelleschi's own genius into something unmistakably modern. Brunelleschi also invented linear perspective. This is not merely a technical footnote. The discovery or invention of a mathematically consistent system for representing three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface was one of the most significant intellectual achievements of the Renaissance, with consequences that extended far beyond painting into mathematics, optics, cartography, and eventually the scientific revolution. Perspective works by organizing all the lines of a picture so that they converge at a single point on the horizon, the vanishing point, creating the illusion that the flat surface of the painting is a window opening onto a real three-dimensional space. Brunelleschi demonstrated the principle through a famous experiment with a painted panel and a mirror. The principle was then codified theoretically by the humanist scholar Leon Battista Alberti in his treatise on painting, written in 1435, and it became the foundational technique of Western painting for the next 4 centuries. Chapter 9: Donatello and the Human Figure. While Brunelleschi was revolutionizing architecture, his friend and sometimes rival Donatello was doing something equally revolutionary in sculpture. Donatello, born around 1386 and dying in 1466, was the greatest sculptor of the 15th century and one of the greatest in the entire history of Western art. He studied the ancient Roman sculpture that survived in collections around Rome and in scattered locations throughout Italy, and he was the first Renaissance sculptor to fully absorb and transform its lessons. The central achievement of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, the achievement that medieval sculpture had largely moved away from, was the representation of the human body as a living thing, inhabiting space, subject to gravity, capable of movement and emotion. The ancient Greeks had discovered that the body looks most natural and most alive when it is shown in a slight contrapposto, a pose in which the weight is shifted onto one leg, causing the hips and shoulders to tilt in opposite directions, creating a subtle S-curve through the body that gives it the appearance of potential movement, as if it might step forward at any moment. This understanding of the body had been largely lost in medieval sculpture, where figures tended to be frontal, static, and more symbolic than naturalistic. Donatello brought it back with an urgency and power that left his contemporaries astounded. His statue of St. George, carved in marble for the Guild of Armorers and installed in a niche on the exterior of the Church of Orsan Michele in Florence, is a revelation. The saint stands with a quiet, watchful authority, his weight slightly forward, his gaze direct and alert. He looks like a real person, a young man of courage and intelligence, not a symbol or an icon, but an individual human being whom you might encounter in the street. But it was his David, cast in bronze and completed sometime in the 1440s, that most fully announced the new age. The David is the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity. It shows the young hero after his victory over Goliath, his foot resting on the giant's severed head, wearing only a hat and boots, his adolescent body depicted with a sensuous accuracy and ease that had not been seen in European art for 1,000 years. There is nothing apologetic or uncomfortable about this nudity. The body is shown as beautiful, as worthy of artistic attention in its own right, as an appropriate subject for the highest art. This was a statement of enormous cultural significance. It said that the human body, the flesh that medieval theology had often regarded with suspicion as the source of sin and temptation, was worthy of celebration. It said that beauty was a real value, one that art should pursue and express, not merely tolerate. It said that the ancient world had known something important about the relationship between beauty and truth that the medieval world had partially forgotten, and that the time had come to remember it. Donatello's other works are equally extraordinary in their range and ambition. His wooden statue of Mary Magdalene, gaunt and haggard from her years of penitence, is one of the most searingly realistic and emotionally powerful sculptures ever made. His bronze equestrian statue of the Venetian general Gadamlotta in Padua was the first large-scale bronze equestrian statue since antiquity, a revival of one of the most prestigious forms of ancient public sculpture. His pulpits for San Lorenzo in Florence, completed near the end of his long life, show a tumultuous, almost expressionistic energy that anticipates the art of the following century. Chapter 10: Masaccio and the Invention of Modern Painting. If Brunelleschi invented perspective and Donatello reinvented sculpture, the task of transforming painting fell to a young man named Masaccio, who was born in 1401 and died, in circumstances that remain mysterious, sometime around 1428. He was 27 years old when he died. In his brief working life, he completely transformed the art of painting. The painting tradition that Masaccio inherited was dominated by the International Gothic style, a beautiful, elegant, sophisticated art of gold leaf and jewel-like color, of graceful decorative line and elaborate surface detail. Its greatest Florentine practitioner in the generation before Masaccio was Lorenzo Monaco. Its most brilliant contemporary was Gentile da Fabriano, whose Adoration of the Magi, painted in 1423, is a masterpiece of courtly magnificence, glittering with gold and populated with elegant figures in gorgeous costumes. Masaccio looked at this tradition and felt its inadequacy for what he wanted to do. He wanted to paint the world as Brunelleschi had shown it could be understood, as a consistent three-dimensional space organized by perspective. He wanted to paint human figures as Donatello had shown they could be depicted, as solid, weighty, psychologically present individuals who occupy real space and are subject to real gravity. He wanted to paint light as it actually behaves, creating shadows that give figures their three-dimensional solidity, illuminating faces and bodies in ways that make them look genuinely present and alive. His frescoes in the Brancacci Chapel of the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence, painted in the early 1420s, achieved all of this with a directness and a power that were almost shocking. The tribute money shows Christ and his disciples in a landscape that uses linear perspective to create a convincing sense of deep space. The figures are weighty and solid, their draperies falling in the heavy folds that real cloth makes rather than the decorative curves of Gothic art. Their faces are individualized and emotionally present. They look like real people, not symbols. The expulsion from paradise is even more powerful. Adam and Eve, driven from the Garden of Eden by an angel with a sword, are shown in a state of utter desolation. Eve's face is thrown back in a howl of grief and shame that is one of the most emotionally intense images in all of Western art. Adam buries his face in his hands. Their bodies are depicted with a physical accuracy and a psychological depth that had not been seen in painting since the ancient world. Masaccio died before he could complete his decoration of the Brancacci Chapel, but what he left behind was enough to change the course of art history. For the rest of the 15th century, every serious Florentine painter came to the Brancacci Chapel to study his frescoes. Botticelli came, Ghirlandaio came, Leonardo da Vinci came, Michelangelo came, and he made drawings from the frescoes, and what he learned from them is visible in everything he subsequently made. The line from Masaccio to the High Renaissance runs straight and clear. Chapter 11. The Quattrocento Flowering. The 15th century in Italy, the Quattrocento as Italians call it, was a period of extraordinary artistic productivity, as the innovations of Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Masaccio were absorbed and extended by a generation of artists of remarkable talent. Fra Angelico, the Dominican friar whose altarpieces and frescoes combine the new naturalism of the Renaissance with a profound and unaffected piety, represents one possibility for how the new art could serve traditional religious purposes. His Annunciation for the convent of San Marco in Florence, painted in the 1440s, shows the angel Gabriel and the Virgin Mary in a loggia whose architecture uses the new perspective and classical vocabulary. But the figures inhabit this space with a spiritual concentration that is entirely devout. The gold of the angel's wings catches light in a way that is both naturalistically observed and clearly symbolic. Fra Angelico navigated the transition from the medieval to the Renaissance world with a grace and a sincerity that are deeply affecting. Leon Battista Alberti represents a different but equally important aspect of the Quattrocento, the humanist polymath, the man who combined theoretical knowledge with practical accomplishment across multiple fields. Alberti was an architect, a painter, a mathematician, a writer, and a theorist of the arts. His three great treatises, on painting, on architecture, and on sculpture, provided the theoretical framework for the new Renaissance arts, articulating the principles of perspective, of the decorum appropriate to different types of painting, of the relationship between beauty and the mathematical ratios found in nature and in the classical tradition. Alberti was also the first important theorist to articulate the concept of the artist as a figure of dignity and learning, not merely a craftsman. In the medieval guild system, painters and sculptors were craftsmen, members of trade guilds, their work understood as skilled manual labor. Alberti argued that the true painter needed to be not just technically skilled, but educated in geometry, in history, in poetry, in all the branches of the studia humanitatis. This elevation of the artist from craftsman to intellectual, from artisan to genius, was one of the crucial cultural shifts of the Renaissance, with consequences that are still visible in how our society understands and values artistic work. Among the painters of the middle and later Quattrocento, several stand out with particular clarity. Piero della Francesca, working in the smaller courts of central Italy, Arezzo, Urbino, Rimini, developed a style of extraordinary calm and luminous precision. His figures inhabit a world of mathematical clarity, where light seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, where space is organized with a geometric perfection that suggests the divine order underlying the visible world. His fresco cycle in Arezzo, depicting the legend of the True Cross, is one of the great achievements of 15th century painting, combining narrative complexity with visual grandeur in a way that is both intellectually and emotionally satisfying. Sandro Botticelli, who worked primarily in Florence under the patronage of the Medici, represents the most fully Neoplatonic expression of Renaissance painting. His great mythological paintings, The Birth of Venus and Primavera, painted in the 1480s for members of the Medici family, are saturated with the Neoplatonic philosophy of Ficino and his circle. Venus rising from the sea is not merely a mythological figure, but a symbol of the divine beauty that descends from the spiritual realm into the material world. The three graces in Primavera, circling in their transparent draperies, embody the Neoplatonic concepts of giving, receiving, and returning the gifts of beauty and love. Botticelli's line is musical, flowing, and supremely elegant. His figures have a quality of wistful, almost melancholy beauty that is unlike anything else in the Renaissance. They seem to exist in a world slightly apart from the everyday, a world of myth and dream and philosophical reflection. Chapter 12. Leonardo da Vinci. No figure in the history of Western culture so fully embodies the Renaissance ideal of the universal man, the Homo universale, as Leonardo da Vinci. He was born in 1452, the illegitimate son of a Florentine notary and a peasant woman, and he died in 1519 in France in the service of the French King Francis I in between. He was the greatest painter of his age, a scientist of extraordinary originality, an engineer of almost incomprehensible range and ingenuity, a musician, a poet, a geologist, a botanist, an anatomist, and an architect. He left behind no finished book, no systematic treatise, no completed scientific work in the conventional sense. What he left are his paintings, numbering perhaps 20, and his notebooks, thousands of pages of drawings and notes in his famously reversed, right-to-left script, a tumultuous, exhilarating record of a mind that could not stop asking questions about how the world worked. Leonardo trained in Florence in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the leading artists of the city, where he learned goldsmithing, painting, and sculpture alongside other talented young men. His talent was evident from the beginning. According to a famous story, when Verrocchio saw the angel that the young Leonardo had painted in a collaborative work, The Baptism of Christ, He was so overwhelmed by its quality that he put down his own brushes and never painted again. The story may be apocryphal, but the angel in the baptism is indeed extraordinary, demonstrating at a very early date the qualities that would define Leonardo's mature work. An almost uncanny ability to render the subtle play of light on skin and drapery, and a penetrating sense of psychological presence. His most famous works need no elaborate introduction. They are among the most reproduced images in the history of art, but they repay careful attention. The Virgin of the Rocks, painted in two versions in the 1480s and 1490s, shows the Virgin Mary, the infant John the Baptist, the infant Christ, and an angel in a mysterious rocky landscape. The figures are arranged in a pyramidal composition that would become one of the defining organizational schemes of high Renaissance painting. The light comes from below as well as above, creating a sfumato, a smoky, atmospheric quality that softens the outlines of forms and gives the whole scene a quality of dreamlike mystery. The psychology of the figures, the angel's knowing glance, the tender protectiveness of the Virgin, the blessing hand of the infant Christ, is expressed through posture and gesture with a subtlety and a depth that is breathtaking. The Last Supper, painted on the wall of the refectory of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan in the 1490s, is perhaps the greatest narrative painting of the Renaissance. Leonardo chose to depict the moment immediately after Christ's announcement that one of the disciples would betray him, and he organized the 12 disciples into groups of 3, each group responding to the terrible news in a different way, expressing through gesture and expression the full range of human responses to shock and grief and guilt. The composition is brilliantly organized around the perspective of the room's architecture, which converges on the figure of Christ at the center, and the architectural setting frames each figure with a precision that gives the whole image an almost theatrical clarity. The Mona Lisa, painted between approximately 1503 and 1519, is the most famous painting in the world, and it has suffered somewhat from that fame, becoming more icon than artwork, the object of pilgrimages and parodies and endless speculation. But if you can set aside all of that and look at it freshly, it is indeed extraordinary. The sitter, probably Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo, is depicted in a three-quarter pose against a fantastic landscape of mountains and water that seems to belong to another world entirely, a primordial geological dreamscape. Her expression, the famous smile that is not quite a smile, is a masterpiece of psychological ambiguity. She seems to be on the verge of saying something, or of not saying something, her inner life both present and withheld, accessible and mysterious simultaneously. Leonardo achieved this quality through his technique of sfumato, the deliberate softening of outlines that prevents the eye from fixing on any single point, and instead creates a sense of constant, subtle movement and uncertainty. It is the visual equivalent of the mystery of personality itself. But Leonardo was not only a painter. His notebooks show a mind of almost frightening curiosity and range. He studied anatomy by dissecting human corpses at a time when this was highly transgressive, making detailed drawings of the muscles, bones, and organs of the body that are among the most beautiful and accurate scientific illustrations ever made. He designed flying machines, inspired by careful observation of birds in flight. He designed military weapons, including a kind of tank and various siege engines. He designed hydraulic systems, canal locks, and urban planning schemes. He studied the behavior of water with an obsessive intensity, filling pages with drawings of currents, waves, and whirlpools. He investigated optics, geology, botany, and the science of painting materials. Very few of these projects were completed. Leonardo was famous in his own time for leaving things unfinished, for moving on to the next fascinating question before the current one was resolved. But the questions he asked, and the quality of his observations, set a standard and an example that would resonate through the following centuries. Chapter 13, Michelangelo. If Leonardo represents the Renaissance ideal of the universal man, the artist as scientist and philosopher, Michelangelo Buonarroti represents something different but equally powerful. The artist as prophet, as a figure of almost superhuman creative intensity whose work is the direct expression of a soul in perpetual struggle with the highest and most difficult questions of human existence. Michelangelo was born in 1475 and died in 1564 at the age of 88, one of the longest lives in the history of art and one of the most productive. In that long life, he produced sculpture, painting, architecture, and poetry of a quality and ambition that have no parallel in the Renaissance or perhaps in any period. He grew up in Florence and was educated in the household of Lorenzo de' Medici, where he absorbed the Neoplatonic philosophy of Ficino and his circle, and encountered the full range of classical sculpture in the Medici gardens. He learned from Donatello's example, from ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, and from the frescoes of Masaccio in the Brancacci Chapel, where he spent hours drawing from the figures of the great predecessor. His earliest masterpieces already demonstrate the extraordinary quality of his gifts. The Pieta, carved in marble when he was only 23 years old and installed in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, shows the Virgin Mary holding the dead body of Christ in her lap. The technical accomplishment is almost incomprehensible. The complex folds of the Virgin's drapery, the perfect anatomy of Christ's body, the way the heavy weight of the dead man's limbs is suggested by their specific postures, all of this carved from a single block of marble with an accuracy and subtlety that left contemporaries literally speechless. The emotional quality of the image is equally extraordinary. The Virgin's face has a quality of serene sorrow that transcends ordinary grief, that suggests a suffering so profound it has moved beyond tears into a kind of divine acceptance. The David, carved between 1501 and 1504 from a massive block of marble that had been partially roughed out and then abandoned by previous sculptors, is perhaps the most celebrated sculpture in Western art. Michelangelo chose to depict David not after his victory over Goliath, as Donatello and Verrocchio had done, but in the moment before the battle, when the young hero has decided to fight and is gathering himself for the confrontation. The statue is 17 feet tall, and the sense of potential energy it contains, of a mind fully committed and a body about to move, is extraordinary. The hands are slightly enlarged, emphasizing their practical importance in the coming battle. The face has an expression of concentrated, almost angry determination. The body is depicted with an anatomical accuracy and a psychological specificity that no previous sculptor had achieved. In 1508, Pope Julius II commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. Michelangelo was a sculptor, not a painter, and he protested the commission. But Julius was not a man who accepted refusals, and Michelangelo went to work. What he created over the next 4 years, lying on scaffolding high above the chapel floor, painting on wet plaster with a physical discomfort he complained about bitterly in the poems he wrote during the project, was one of the greatest works of art in human history. The Sistine ceiling covers more than 5,000 square feet and contains hundreds of figures. At its center is the narrative of the book of Genesis, from the creation of the world through the drunkenness of Noah. Surrounding these central scenes are figures of prophets and sibyls, of ignudi nude young men whose symbolic significance has been debated ever since, and of the ancestors of Christ. In the corner sections are dramatic scenes of the salvation of Israel. The most famous image on the ceiling is the creation of Adam, in which God, surrounded by angels and wrapped in a swirling purple robe, stretches his right hand toward Adam, who lies on the earth below, his own arm raised, his finger almost but not quite touching the divine finger. The tiny gap between the two fingers concentrates an enormous emotional charge. It is the gap between the human and the divine, the gap across which the spark of life and consciousness passes. The image has become one of the most reproduced in the history of art, a symbol of human creativity and aspiration that has transcended its original religious context. Michelangelo spent the last 3 decades of his very long life primarily as an architect, designing the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, which was completed after his death, and various other buildings in Rome and Florence. He also continued to sculpt, producing a series of late works that have a deliberately unfinished, struggling quality, figures that seem to be in the process of emerging from the stone, as if the material world were reluctantly releasing them. And he wrote poetry throughout his life, a body of sonnets and other poems that explore, with great intellectual and emotional intensity, the themes that obsessed him: the relationship between beauty and God, the struggle of the soul toward divine love, the tragedy of age and the fear of death. Chapter 14. Raphael and the High Renaissance. The period roughly from 1490 to 1527, often called the High Renaissance, was the moment when the experiments and innovations of the Quattrocento came together in a synthesis of such formal perfection and expressive power that it became the standard against which all subsequent European art was measured for centuries. Raphael Sanzio, born in 1483 and dying tragically young at 37 in 1520, was the supreme master of the High Renaissance synthesis. Where Leonardo suggested mystery and Michelangelo expressed torment, Raphael embodied harmony, a classical balance of composition, a grace and beauty of figure, a luminous clarity of color, and a seemingly effortless integration of multiple figures in complex spatial arrangements that gave his paintings the quality of inevitability, of rightness, as if they could not possibly be other than they are. Raphael trained in the workshop of Perugino in Umbria, absorbing the gentle, harmonious style of that master. But when he came to Florence in 1504 and encountered the work of Leonardo and Michelangelo, he realized immediately that he was in the presence of something fundamentally greater than what he had learned, and with a combination of extraordinary talent and intellectual humility, he set about learning from them. He studied Leonardo's compositional methods, his sfumato technique, his pyramidal groupings. He studied Michelangelo's monumental figures and his understanding of anatomy. But what he made from these lessons was distinctly his own. His Madonnas, the small devotional paintings of the Virgin and Child that he produced in large numbers during his Florentine years, achieve a perfection of tender, harmonious beauty that has never been surpassed in Western art. The figures have a physical solidity and a psychological warmth that are entirely natural, without effort or strain, as if painting this well were simply what painting was. In Rome, where he was summoned by Pope Julius II in 1508, the same year Michelangelo began the Sistine ceiling, Raphael created his greatest works, the frescoes in the papal apartments known as the Stands di Raffaello. The most famous of these, the School of Athens, depicts the great philosophers of antiquity gathered together in a magnificent classical architectural setting. Plato and Aristotle stand at the center, Plato gesturing upward toward the realm of ideal forms, Aristotle gesturing outward toward the material world. Around them are figures identifiable as Socrates, Euclid, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and others. The composition is a masterpiece of spatial organization, using the perspective of the barrel-vaulted architectural setting to draw the eye deep into the picture space, while accommodating dozens of individual figures in distinct and characterful poses. The School of Athens is often taken as a kind of emblem of the Renaissance itself, the celebration of ancient wisdom, the confidence in human reason, the belief that the great questions of philosophy and science are worth asking, and that human minds are capable of addressing them, the sense that all the wisdom of the tradition can be brought together in a single harmonious vision. Chapter 15. Venice and its painters. While Florence was the birthplace of the Renaissance and Rome was the site of its greatest papal patronage, Venice developed a parallel tradition of painting that was, in important ways, distinctly different from the Florentine mainstream. Venice was a city unlike any other in Europe. Built on a lagoon in the northern Adriatic, it had grown wealthy through maritime trade with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, and this commercial and cultural contact had given Venetian art a characteristic richness of color and texture that distinguished it from the more linear and intellectually austere tradition of Florentine painting. The Bellini family dominated Venetian painting for much of the 15th century. Jacopo Bellini, the father, was a pioneer of the new Renaissance style in Venice. His sons Giovanni and Gentile carried the family tradition forward into the new century. Giovanni Bellini was one of the great painters of the 15th century anywhere in Italy. His altarpieces combine a deep Christian piety with a new naturalism of landscape and light, and his figures have a quiet, meditative presence that is deeply affecting. He was also the teacher who trained the two greatest Venetian painters of the following generation, Giorgione and Titian. Giorgione was perhaps the most mysterious figure in the history of Renaissance painting. He died young, probably of plague, around 1510, leaving only a handful of works that can be attributed to him with confidence. But those few works established an entirely new type of painting, the poesia, the painted poem, a picture whose subject is not a narrative or a religious scene but a mood, an atmosphere, a state of feeling. His Tempest, showing two figures in a landscape under a stormy sky, with a bolt of lightning in the background, has been interpreted and reinterpreted for 5 centuries without any consensus on what it depicts. And perhaps that is the point. It is not a story but a feeling, the feeling of a moment charged with mystery and unease, the feeling of the world as a beautiful and incomprehensible place. Titian, who was born around 1490 and died in 1576, was the greatest of all the Venetian painters and one of the greatest painters in the history of Western art. His working life spanned more than 60 years, and in that time he produced an enormous body of work of extraordinary range and consistent quality. He painted religious subjects, mythological subjects, portraits, and allegories with equal mastery. His technique, building up rich layers of color with broad, increasingly free brushstrokes, achieved effects of light and texture and atmospheric depth that have influenced painters from his day to the present. His late works, painted when he was in his 80s, have a quality of tragic grandeur that is unlike anything else in the Renaissance. His Pieta, painted for his own tomb and left unfinished at his death, is a monument of feeling. The figures are barely resolved from the paint, the whole surface vibrating with an emotional intensity that technique alone cannot explain, as if the old man is pouring into his work everything he knows about grief and mortality and faith. Chapter 16. The Northern Renaissance. The Renaissance was not an exclusively Italian phenomenon. As Italian ideas, books, artworks, and artists spread northward across the Alps throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, they encountered the distinct cultures of Northern Europe and produced a remarkable synthesis. The Northern Renaissance is different from the Italian in important ways. Where Italian Renaissance humanism was primarily focused on the ancient Latin and Greek classics, Northern humanism tended to be more biblically focused, more concerned with the recovery and correct interpretation of early Christian texts. This orientation, combined with the new critical methods of textual scholarship, would eventually generate the explosive force of the Protestant Reformation. Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, born around 1466 and dying in 1536, was the greatest of the Northern humanists. A man of formidable learning and equally formidable wit, he traveled throughout Europe, corresponding with scholars, rulers, and church leaders, writing works that combined classical scholarship with Christian piety in a form that was accessible, engaging, and often sharply satirical. His most famous work, In Praise of Folly, is a sustained satirical address delivered by the personification of Folly herself, who proceeds to demonstrate, with devastating logic and considerable humor, that human beings consistently choose foolish pleasures and self-deceptions over wisdom, and that the Church is no exception. The satire is directed primarily at monks, priests, and theologians, who pursue empty scholastic debates while neglecting the practical and spiritual core of Christian life. Erasmus also produced a critical edition of the Greek New Testament with a new Latin translation, demonstrating through careful textual scholarship that the standard Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, contained numerous errors. This was not merely an academic matter. If the standard text of the Bible was inaccurate, then doctrines and practices based on particular readings of that text might need to be reconsidered. The implications were enormous. In Germany, the artist Albrecht Dürer was the northern equivalent of Leonardo, a man of extraordinary intellectual curiosity and range who combined technical mastery in multiple media, painting, drawing, and engraving, with a genuine theoretical understanding of the principles underlying his art. He traveled to Italy and absorbed the lessons of Italian Renaissance painting, bringing them back to the North and transforming them through his own very different sensibility. His prints, woodcuts, and copper engravings spread Italian Renaissance ideas across Northern Europe in a form that could be reproduced and distributed widely, making them one of the great instruments of cultural transmission in the 16th century. In the Netherlands, a remarkable tradition of painting had been developing throughout the 15th century, associated primarily with Jan van Eyck and his successors. This tradition was in some ways parallel to, and in some ways independent of the Italian Renaissance. It shared the Italian interest in naturalism, in the careful observation of the visible world, in the depiction of real space and real light. But it achieved these effects through different means. Through the meticulous, patient application of oil paint in thin, translucent glazes, rather than through the architectural use of perspective that was central to the Italian tradition. Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, completed in 1432, is one of the greatest paintings of the entire Renaissance period anywhere in Europe. Its combination of visionary splendor and meticulous naturalistic detail, the way it depicts both the heavenly court of God and the world of earthly flowers and landscapes with equal precision and intensity, represents an entirely distinct achievement from the Italian Renaissance, but one no less extraordinary. Chapter 17: The Reformation and its Consequences for Art. In 1517, a German monk and theologian named Martin Luther nailed a document to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. The document contained 95 theses, points of dispute about the practices and doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, particularly the sale of indulgences, the practice by which the Church offered remission of sins in exchange for financial payment. Luther was not, initially, trying to split the Church. He was a reformer who believed the institution he loved was being corrupted by abuses that could and should be corrected. But the response to his challenge, and his own subsequent development of a theological position that went far beyond objections to indulgences to challenge the fundamental doctrinal structure of Roman Catholicism, set in motion a process that would permanently divide Western Christianity. The Protestant Reformation had profound consequences for art. In many Protestant territories, particularly those influenced by the more radical strands of Reformed theology associated with Zwingli in Zurich and Calvin in Geneva, religious images were rejected as idolatrous, as violations of the biblical prohibition against graven images. Iconoclasm, the destruction of religious art, swept through churches across Northern Europe. Statues were smashed. Frescoes were whitewashed. Altarpieces were burned or removed. The rich visual culture of the Catholic Church, the very culture that the Renaissance had enriched with such extraordinary creativity, was declared an abomination in large parts of the continent. This was catastrophic for art in the affected regions, at least in the short term. Painters and sculptors who had depended on church commissions for their livelihood suddenly found themselves without their primary market. In some places and at some times, This produced genuine artistic impoverishment. But the Reformation also had more complex consequences. In Protestant regions, new types of painting developed to fill the spaces left by the destruction of religious art. Portrait painting flourished, as wealthy merchants and civic leaders commissioned likenesses of themselves and their families. Genre painting, the depiction of everyday domestic scenes, developed as a subject worthy of serious artistic attention. Landscape painting, freed from the need to serve as a backdrop for religious narrative, began to be treated as a subject in its own right. In Catholic regions, the Counter-Reformation, the Church's response to the Protestant challenge, produced its own artistic consequences. The Council of Trent, which met intermittently from 1545 to 1563, issued guidelines for religious art that demanded clarity of narrative, emotional accessibility, and decorum, rejecting the sometimes obscure intellectual complexity of late Renaissance mannerism in favor of a more direct emotional appeal. This demand produced the style we now call Baroque, which in its greatest practitioners, Caravaggio, Rubens, Bernini, represents a new and extraordinarily powerful flowering of European visual culture. Chapter 18: The Renaissance and Scientific Thought. The Renaissance is often understood primarily as a cultural and artistic phenomenon, and that understanding is not wrong. But it was also the period during which the foundations of the modern scientific revolution were laid, and the connections between humanist scholarship, artistic practice, and scientific inquiry are deeper and more interesting than is often recognized. The humanist recovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts included scientific and philosophical works, the atomism of Lucretius, the mathematical philosophy of Plato, the empirical biology of Aristotle, the astronomical models of Ptolemy. These texts provided not just information but models of how to think about the natural world, how to combine observation with theory, how to use mathematics to describe physical phenomena. The practice of perspective in painting, pioneered by Brunelleschi and theorized by Alberti, was not merely an artistic technique. It was an application of mathematics to the description of visual experience, and it required artists to think carefully and precisely about optics, about the geometry of vision, about the relationship between the eye, the object, and the intervening space. Leonardo's investigations of optics, of the mechanics of the eye, of the behavior of light, grew directly from his practice as a painter. The anatomical studies of the Renaissance, driven in part by the desire of painters and sculptors to represent the human body accurately, produced genuine advances in medical knowledge. Leonardo's anatomical drawings, and the more systematic work of the Flemish anatomist Andreas Vesalius, whose On the Fabric of the Human Body was published in 1543, challenged and corrected the inherited anatomical knowledge of the ancient Greek physician Galen, which had been accepted as authoritative for more than 1,000 years. Vesalius was working at the University of Padua, one of the great centers of Renaissance learning, a university where Aristotle was read with a new critical scrutiny, and where empirical observation was beginning to be valued as a check on received authority. Padua also trained Galileo Galilei, who was born in 1564, the year Michelangelo died, and whose work in mechanics and astronomy would be the most important single contribution to the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Nicolaus Copernicus, whose heliocentric model of the solar system was published in 1543, the same year as Vesalius's anatomy, had been educated in the humanist tradition, studying canon law, medicine, and mathematics at the University of Krakow and later in Italy. His revolutionary proposal that the Earth moved around the Sun, rather than the Sun around the Earth, was presented with the mathematical rigor of the ancient astronomical tradition, but it also reflected a Neoplatonic assumption that the Sun, as the source of light and warmth, was the most appropriate center of the universe. The Renaissance did not produce the scientific revolution directly, That was the achievement of the 17th century, of Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, and Newton. But it created the cultural conditions in which a scientific revolution was possible. The recovery of ancient mathematical and philosophical texts, the habit of critical reading and comparison of sources, the willingness to challenge received authority, the value placed on careful observation of the natural world, and the confidence that human reason was capable of understanding that world. Chapter 19. The Renaissance and Literature. The literary achievements of the Renaissance are as extraordinary as its visual arts, and in some ways more immediately accessible to us, because literature requires no specialized knowledge of technique to appreciate. Dante Alighieri, who died in 1321, stands at the threshold of the Renaissance rather than within it, but his influence on the literature that followed was incalculable. His Divine Comedy, a poem of extraordinary ambition and complexity that depicts the poet's journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven, was the supreme achievement of Italian vernacular literature, and established that the Italian language was capable of the highest artistic and intellectual achievement. It also, in its vivid depictions of real contemporary Florentines among the souls of the damned and the blessed, demonstrated that individual human beings, specific people with specific personalities and specific histories, were worthy subjects for the highest art. Petrarch's sonnets to Laura, as we have seen, established the lyric tradition that would dominate European poetry for the next 2 centuries. The Petrarchan sonnet, with its 14 lines, its octave and sestet, its meditative exploration of love and time and beauty, became the dominant poetic form across Europe, adapted into English by Surrey and Sidney and Spenser, into French by Ronsard, into Portuguese by Camões. Boccaccio's Decameron established the tradition of vernacular prose narrative that would eventually lead, through many transformations, to the modern novel. But the literary achievement of the Renaissance did not stop with these Trecento pioneers. The 16th century produced a remarkable flowering of literature across Europe. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in Florence in the early 16th century in the aftermath of the traumatic events that had ended the Medici era and then restored it, produced 2 works of enduring importance. The Prince, written in 1513, is a manual for rulers that takes human nature and political reality as it is, not as idealists wish it were. Machiavelli's willingness to discuss the use of force and deception as political tools, his argument that a ruler must sometimes act in ways that seem immoral in order to preserve the state, was shocking to contemporaries and has remained controversial ever since. The Discourses on Livy is a longer and in many ways more profound work, a meditation on republican government inspired by the history of ancient Rome. Machiavelli was not a cynic. He was a patriot and a humanist who had served the Florentine Republic in high office and who was devastated by its fall. His political writings are the product of a mind that has looked at political reality with unflinching honesty and tried to understand what actually makes states succeed or fail. His influence on subsequent political thought and on the entire subsequent tradition of political realism is immense. Francesco Guicciardini, Machiavelli's contemporary and friend, wrote a history of Italy that is one of the first works of modern historical analysis, applying to Italian affairs the same kind of clear-eyed, empirical scrutiny that Machiavelli applied to politics. In France, Michel de Montaigne invented a new literary form, the essay, which he used to explore his own thoughts, feelings, and experiences with a candor and a self-awareness that was entirely new. His essays, begun in 1572 and revised and expanded throughout the rest of his life, are one of the great monuments of French literature and one of the most attractive products of the entire Renaissance spirit. A man sitting in his library, thinking about what he knows and does not know, about what it means to be human, about how to live, with a humility and an intelligence and a warmth that speak across the centuries with complete immediacy. In England, the Elizabethan era, which spans roughly the last 40 years of the 16th century, saw a literary flowering of extraordinary vitality. Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene combined the allegorical tradition of medieval romance with Renaissance Neoplatonic philosophy and the political needs of the Elizabethan court. Philip Sidney's Arcadia and his sonnet sequence Astrophil and Stella were major achievements of Renaissance prose and poetry. Christopher Marlowe's plays, particularly Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine, explored the Renaissance themes of ambition, knowledge, and the overreaching of human limits with a dramatic intensity that laid the groundwork for the greatest achievement of English Renaissance literature, the plays of William Shakespeare. Chapter 20: Shakespeare and the Renaissance Vision of Humanity. William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564 and died there in 1616. In between, he wrote 37 plays, 154 sonnets, and several longer poems, a body of work that most students of literature regard as the greatest achievement in the English language and one of the greatest in any language. Shakespeare absorbed the full range of Renaissance culture, the humanist concern with history and with classical antiquity, the Neoplatonic ideas about love and beauty that saturated the poetry of the period, the new psychology of the individual that the Renaissance had developed, the theatrical traditions of ancient Rome and the medieval morality play, the energy and ambition of Elizabethan England. From all of this, he made something that transcends its sources. His plays contain the most varied and psychologically complex gallery of human characters in literature, from the murderous self-examination of Macbeth to the philosophical melancholy of Hamlet, from the magnificent self-possession of Cleopatra to the tender foolishness of Bottom, from the villainous intelligence of Iago to the sublime vulnerability of King Lear. What Shakespeare shares most deeply with the Renaissance is the quality of attention he brings to human beings. He looks at people, all kinds of people, kings and servants, lovers and murderers, fools and scholars, with a warmth and an interest and a curiosity that are entirely without condescension. Every character in his plays has interiority, has an inner life that is more complex than can be fully expressed in words. Every character has reasons for what they do, however terrible those things are. This is the Renaissance vision of humanity carried to its fullest expression. Human beings as worthy of the most serious and the most loving attention, as complex and contradictory, and morally ambiguous in ways that make simple judgment impossible, as capable of extraordinary nobility and extraordinary corruption, as creatures who live in time and feel the weight of time, who love and grieve and hope and despair, who seek meaning in a world that does not always provide it clearly. Hamlet, perhaps the most written about character in all of literature, is in many ways the exemplary Renaissance man. Educated, philosophical, aware of the new learning, full of questions about the nature of reality and the meaning of moral action, paralyzed by the gap between thought and action that the Renaissance itself had in some ways created by teaching people to think too well and too much. His famous soliloquies are not mere theatrical speeches, but genuine philosophical meditations on the problems that Renaissance humanism had raised without being able to resolve. The problem of knowledge, of moral certainty, of how to act in a world where everything is more complicated than it seems. The plays end, and the audience files out into the London night, or sits in silence wherever they have been reading, carrying with them the memory of people who seemed entirely real, who seemed to speak directly to something fundamental in human experience. This is what the Renaissance gave to literature, the confidence to look at human beings as they are, in all their complexity and contradiction, and to find them not frightening but endlessly fascinating. Chapter 21: The Renaissance and Music. The visual arts and literature have tended to dominate accounts of the Renaissance, but music was equally transformed during this period, and the musical culture of the Renaissance deserves its own moment of attention. Medieval music had been dominated by the church and by the sophisticated polyphonic tradition of vocal music that had developed in the great cathedrals of northern France. Composers like Guillaume de Machaut had created music of great complexity and beauty, but it was primarily designed for liturgical use, for the enhancement of worship. The Renaissance brought a new orientation to music that paralleled the transformations happening in the visual arts. Music began to be understood as an art with its own principles and its own capacity for beauty, not merely as a servant of religious function. Ancient Greek ideas about the power of music to move the emotions, ideas transmitted through humanist scholarship, began to influence how composers thought about what music was for and what it could do. The great Flemish composers of the 15th century, Guillaume Dufay, Johannes Ockeghem, and Josquin des Prez, brought the tradition of polyphony to a new level of expressiveness and technical mastery. Josquin des Prez, in particular, who died in 1521, was regarded by contemporaries as the greatest composer of the age. And his masses and motets demonstrate a perfect union of technical sophistication and emotional directness that was recognized immediately as something new. In Italy, a new tradition of secular song developed around the courts and academies where humanist culture flourished. The frottala, a simple, tuneful setting of vernacular poetry, evolved through the 16th century into the madrigal, a more sophisticated and expressive form that set the great texts of Italian Renaissance poetry, Petrarch's sonnets most prominently, with music that aimed to illustrate and intensify the emotional content of the words. Composers like Luca Marenzio and Carlo Gesualdo brought the madrigal to an extraordinary expressive peak in the late 16th century, using harmonic dissonance and chromatic shifts to capture the anguish of unrequited love and the sweetness of its brief satisfactions. The development of music printing in the early 16th century, following the invention of movable type by Gutenberg in the 1450s, transformed the dissemination of music just as it transformed the dissemination of books. Sheet music could now be reproduced and distributed across Europe, and a European musical culture of unprecedented richness and interconnectedness began to develop. At the end of the Renaissance period, a group of Florentine musicians and scholars known as the Camerata attempted to revive what they imagined to be the practice of ancient Greek tragedy, in which all the text was sung rather than spoken. Their experiments led to the invention of opera around 1600, one of the most significant musical innovations in history. The first operas, by Jacopo Piri and Giulio Caccini, were deliberate attempts to apply Renaissance humanist principles to music, to make music serve the expression of human feeling as the humanists believed the ancient Greeks had done. Chapter 22: Women in the Renaissance. Any honest account of the Renaissance must grapple with a fundamental contradiction at its heart. A culture that celebrated human dignity, human potential, and human achievement had a deeply limited and often oppressive understanding of the humanity of women. The Renaissance ideal of the universal man was, emphatically, an ideal for men. Women were excluded from the universities, from the guilds, from public office, from most of the institutional structures through which Renaissance culture was produced and transmitted. The humanist program of education, with all its emphasis on the cultivation of the full human person through learning and civic engagement, was designed for men and largely denied to women. And yet women were not absent from the culture of the Renaissance. They were present as patrons, as subjects, and in some remarkable cases as creators. As patrons, aristocratic and wealthy women exercised considerable influence over the cultural production of the period. Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua, was one of the greatest art patrons of the Renaissance, a woman of formidable intelligence and taste who corresponded with artists, commissioning works with a specificity and sophistication that reflected genuine learning and aesthetic judgment. Her studiolo, a small private room decorated with paintings, sculpture, and intarsia woodwork of extraordinary quality, was a monument to humanist learning and to her own personal vision. As subjects, women were everywhere in Renaissance art, From the Madonnas and Venuses and female saints that populated the visual culture of the period, to the portraits of specific aristocratic and bourgeois women that painters like Raphael, Leonardo, and Titian produced with increasing frequency and psychological acuity through the 16th century. But it is as creators that the story of women in the Renaissance is most remarkable and most poignant. A small number of exceptional women managed, against enormous obstacles, to achieve significant creative accomplishment. Gaspara Stampa was a Venetian poet of the mid-16th century whose collected sonnets, modeled on Petrarch but transformed by her own fierce and personal voice, constitute one of the major poetic achievements of the period. She wrote from the position of the beloved rather than the lover, from the perspective of a woman who felt desire and loss with all the intensity that Petrarch had attributed to his unrequited love for Laura, and who refused to be merely the passive object of someone else's adoration. Sofonisba Anguissola, born around 1532 and dying in 1625 at the astonishing age of 93, was one of the most accomplished painters of the late Renaissance, famous throughout Europe during her lifetime. She spent many years as court painter to Philip II of Spain and produced portraits of exceptional quality and psychological insight. Vasari, the great chronicler of Renaissance artists, praised her work explicitly and visited her to see her paintings. She demonstrates that women could achieve the highest artistic standards when they were given even minimal access to training and opportunity. Artemisia Gentileschi, born in 1593, belongs technically to the Baroque period that followed the Renaissance, but she is worth mentioning here as the culmination of the tradition of women painters. The daughter of a painter, she was trained in her father's workshop and became one of the most powerful painters of her century, producing large-scale historical and biblical paintings with a dramatic intensity and a technical mastery equal to the greatest male painters of her age. The story of women in the Renaissance is not a story of equal access or equal recognition, but it is a story of remarkable individual achievement in the face of systematic exclusion, and it complicates and enriches our understanding of what the Renaissance was and what it meant. Chapter 23: The End of an Era. Historians debate when the Renaissance ended, as they debate when it began. There is no single moment, no dramatic event, that marks a clear boundary between the Renaissance and what came after it. Some point to 1527 and the sack of Rome, when the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, largely composed of unpaid German Lutheran soldiers, sacked the city of Rome with a thoroughness and a violence that shocked Europe. The Pope was besieged in the Castel Sant'Angelo. Churches were desecrated. Artists and scholars fled. The fragile, brilliant world of high Renaissance Rome was shattered, and many of those who survived scattered across the continent, carrying Renaissance ideas to new centers as they went. Others point to the death of specific figures: Raphael in 1520, Leonardo in 1519, Erasmus in 1536, Michelangelo in 1564. The gradual disappearance of the great generation of the High Renaissance marks a cultural shift, even if individual achievements continued, and in some cases, Titian in Venice, Shakespeare in England, continued for decades after. Still others point to the rise of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation as fundamentally changing the cultural environment in which the Renaissance had flourished. The confident humanist synthesis, the belief that the wisdom of the ancients and the truth of Christianity could be harmoniously reconciled, that the world was a place of beauty and order worthy of human attention and celebration, was increasingly difficult to sustain in a Europe torn by religious war and doctrinal conflict. The style we call Mannerism, which developed in the decades after 1520, in some ways reflects this crisis of confidence. Mannerist art, in painters like Pontormo, Rosso Fiorentino, Parmigianino, and the later works of Michelangelo himself, deliberately violates the harmonious proportions and serene clarity of the High Renaissance. Figures are elongated, poses are forced and unnatural, colors are harsh or startling, Compositions are crowded and unstable. This is not incompetence but a deliberate artistic strategy, a response to a world that no longer feels harmonious and rational, that feels instead strange, pressured, and uncertain. And yet the Renaissance did not simply end. It transformed itself. The Baroque art of the 17th century, the scientific revolution, the beginnings of the Enlightenment, all of these are the direct heirs of the Renaissance, carrying forward the fundamental commitments to reason, observation, individual dignity, and the worth of the human world that the Renaissance had established. Chapter 24: The Legacy of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was not merely a historical period. It was a fundamental reorientation of Western culture that has shaped everything that came after it, including the world we live in today. The modern concept of the individual, the idea that each person has an inner life, a personality, a unique perspective on the world that is worthy of respect and attention, is a Renaissance inheritance. It was the humanists who first articulated clearly the idea that the cultivation of the individual, through education, through experience, through reflection, was a central human task. It was Renaissance art that first represented individual human beings with a psychological depth and specificity that treated them as ends in themselves rather than as types or symbols. The modern concept of secular culture, the idea that literature and art and music and philosophy can have value and can be pursued for their own sake, independent of their service to religious purposes, is a Renaissance inheritance. The medieval world had not entirely lacked secular culture, but it had generally regarded secular pursuits as less important than religious ones. The Renaissance insisted on the value of the world as it is, of human experience in all its richness and complexity, and this insistence has become so fundamental to our culture that we barely notice it. The modern concept of the artist as a creative individual of special dignity and importance, rather than a craftsman who executes a commission according to received conventions, is a Renaissance inheritance. The elevation of the artist that Alberti theorized and that figures like Leonardo and Michelangelo embodied in their own lives and work has shaped the entire subsequent history of art and of our culture's relationship with creativity. The critical methods of Renaissance scholarship, the careful comparison of sources, the attention to historical context, the willingness to question received authority in the light of evidence, are the direct ancestors of modern historical scholarship, modern literary criticism, and modern scientific methodology. The humanists who edited ancient texts and the anatomists who dissected human bodies were engaged in essentially the same intellectual project, the attempt to understand the world as it actually is, rather than as tradition says it should be. The political thought of the Renaissance, from Machiavelli's clear-eyed analysis of power to the humanists' revival of ancient republican ideas, helped lay the groundwork for the development of modern political theory, including the concepts of sovereignty, the state, and eventually democracy. The geographical explorations of the Renaissance era, Columbus's voyage to America in 1492, Vasco da Gama's rounding of Africa, Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe, are not usually thought of as part of the Renaissance, but they are deeply connected to it. The same spirit of inquiry, the same confidence in human reason and human capability, the same desire to know the world as it actually is, animated both the scholars who recovered ancient texts and the sailors who sailed into unknown oceans. The Renaissance gave Western culture its confidence in itself, its belief that human beings are capable of understanding and improving the world, that beauty is a real value, that knowledge is worth pursuing for its own sake, that the individual human life has dignity and meaning. These beliefs are not universal, and they are not uncontested. The history of the 5 centuries since the Renaissance has provided ample evidence that they can be distorted, betrayed, and weaponized. But they remain the foundation of much of what is best in the civilization that descended from the Renaissance. Chapter 25, Drifting Toward Sleep. We have traveled a long way tonight, across 2 centuries and a dozen cities, through workshops smelling of linseed oil and marble dust, through libraries filled with newly discovered manuscripts, through churches hung with paintings of an unprecedented beauty, through the thoughts of men and women who looked at the world with fresh eyes and were astonished by what they saw. We have met Petrarch, sitting in his study in Avignon, writing letters to the dead Cicero as if he were a beloved friend just temporarily out of reach. We have met Brunelleschi, staring up at the impossible gap in the roof of the cathedral and beginning to see, somewhere in the geometry of the problem, the shape of its solution. We have met Masaccio, dipping his brush in plaster on a chapel wall and painting a woman's grief so truthfully that it still causes pain to look at it. We have met Leonardo, filling notebook after notebook with questions about birds and water and light and the human body, never quite satisfied, never quite finished, always moving on to the next astonishing thing. We have met Michelangelo, lying on his back in the darkness of the Sistine Chapel, painting God reaching toward Adam with an almost unbearable tenderness. We have met Raphael, painting philosophers from 25 centuries into a single harmonious gathering, as if time were no obstacle to the fellowship of minds. We have met Shakespeare, sitting in his theater above the Thames, listening to actors speak the words he had given them and hearing them become, in some mysterious way, more than words. All of them are gone now. The workshops are empty. The scaffolding has long since come down. The marble cools in the museum galleries where generations of visitors stand before it and feel something rise in them that they cannot quite name, something that has to do with beauty and with the strange fact that human beings, mortal and small and confused as they so often are also capable of this. The Renaissance happened. It was real. It changed the world, and the world it changed is ours. When you wake tomorrow and look at a painting or read a poem or watch a play or simply pause to notice the quality of light in a room, you are living in a world made partly by those men and women who decided, in Florence and Venice and Rome and London and Amsterdam, that the world as it is deserves the most serious and the most loving attention we can give it. The candle goes out now, the city is quiet, the stars are out. Somewhere in the darkness, a dome rises against the sky, a curve of perfect geometry against the Florentine night, and in its shadow the city breathes and sleeps. Sleep now, the story is told. The beauty remains. Historical notes. On sources and scholarship. The study of the Renaissance has produced an enormous scholarly literature over the past century and a half. The Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt's The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, published in 1860, was the founding text of modern Renaissance studies and remains worth reading today for the quality of its prose and the acuity of its observation, even where subsequent scholarship has revised or challenged its conclusions. Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, first published in 1550 and expanded in 1568, is the primary source for many of the biographical anecdotes that form the substance of Renaissance art history. Vasari was himself an artist and a friend of Michelangelo, and his accounts of the great artists of his century are vivid and intimate even when they are not entirely reliable. The secret history of the Mongols and similar primary sources have their Renaissance equivalents in the diaries, letters, and chronicles of Florentine merchants and humanist scholars, which provide an extraordinary window into the daily life and cultural values of the period. The Ricordans, or memory books, kept by Florentine businessmen, are particularly revealing about the intersection of commerce and culture. On dates and chronology. The dates given in this documentary are in many cases approximate. Birth and death dates for medieval and early Renaissance figures are often uncertain. The chronologies of specific artworks are frequently disputed. The broad narrative structure is reliable, but the specific dates should be understood as provisional. On the scope of the Renaissance. This documentary has focused primarily on the Italian Renaissance and its Northern European extensions. It has not done justice to the Renaissance cultures of Spain and Portugal, of Poland and Bohemia, of the Ottoman Empire and its complex relationship with the Byzantine heritage. The Renaissance was a European-wide, and in some ways a global phenomenon, and any single narrative of it necessarily simplifies and omits. On the question of legacy, the relationship between the Renaissance and the colonial project of European expansion is one that historians continue to debate, and that cannot be addressed adequately in a documentary of this length. The same confidence in human reason and human capability that produced the art and scholarship of the Renaissance also produced the intellectual frameworks that justified the conquest and exploitation of other peoples and other cultures. The legacy of the Renaissance is not simple or unambiguous, and honest engagement with it requires acknowledgement of its shadows as well as its lights.